Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Meghan Leemon. I'm an attorney with PilieroMazza in our government contracts group. Today, we're going to be talking about the changing certification requirements for SDVOSBs and VOSBs, or the common acronym for Service Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Businesses and then Veteran-Owned Small Businesses. I am, like I said, I'm part of our government contracts group here at PilieroMazza. My kind of focus and bread and butter is on everything small business, including all of SBA's programs, inclusive of the SDVOSB program as well. A little bit about our firm. We are a full-service business law firm that specializes in catering to government contractors. But we do offer and service companies that are not part of the government contracting community. We do have 4 main practice groups, our biggest being the government contracting group. Then we have a litigation group, a labor and employment group, and a business and transactions group. Today, if you're joining us, I assume you are either an SDVOSB or VOSB or in the process of considering certification. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So today we're going to be talking about eligibility requirements and benefits for SDVOSBs and VOSBs. So you may think, I'm a service disabled veteran, okay, now what? Or I'm a veteran, now what? So we're going to be talking through some of the requirements for certification and what those might look like to make sure you qualify. And if not, there might be some adjustments that can be done in order to ensure compliance. We're going to be talking about the proposed rule that SBA issued in July, covering the certification and how this process is going to work starting in January, and then how to prepare for certification. Before we dive right in, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them as we go. You can use the chat or the question box on the right-hand side, and I don't expect this to take the full hour, so hopefully I can give you a little bit of your time back at the end of it. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right on in. So before we get into the proposed rule and what the certification procedures will be, I'm going to first give a high level of what are the requirements to be certified as an SDVOSB. And when I say SDVOSB, the same rules and regulations will apply to veteran-owned small businesses. It's just that the veteran-owned small business designation is not going to be used by other agencies and will continue to exist only in the Department of Veterans Affairs realm. So it doesn't have as wide-reaching benefit for companies as it does in the VA, but the same ownership and control requirements will apply if you're a veteran-owned small business versus a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. The only difference, obviously, being that the qualifying owner has a service-connected disability in the SDVOSB context. So at a high level, in terms of the ownership and control requirements, the entity must be at least 51% owned and controlled by one or more service-disabled veterans. This does not necessarily have to be the same SDV, so I'll get into that and what that means in a minute. In terms of ownership, the ownership must be unconditional and direct. So what this means is that there can be effectively no restrictions on the service-disabled veterans' ownership, meaning there should be no restrictions on the ability to sell, transfer, dispose of their ownership. In terms of what direct ownership means, this means that the individual, the service-disabled veteran or veteran for a veteran-owned small business, must directly own the ownership. It cannot be through another entity. There is an exception for a trust, such as a living trust, but other than that, you cannot, flow the service-disabled veteran status down through companies. The individual must actually hold the ownership in their individual capacity. In terms of control, both the long-term and day-to-day decisions and management of the company must be controlled by one or more SDVs. Or in the case of a veteran with a permanent and severe disability, the spouse or permanent caregiver. I'm not going to get into the unique requirements for spouse or permanent caregiver, but that is an option and available in the SDVOSB context. To kind of further elaborate on what control means in the SDVOSB or VOSB world, SBA has a very kind of unique and rigid set of control requirements. The service-disabled veteran must have the level of managerial experience of the extent and complexity needed to run the concern and also hold the highest officer position. In addition to holding the highest officer position, the SDV must work full-time for the company and be the highest compensated. There are some exceptions or in kind of wiggle room to these general rules, but these are kind of the general rules and the easiest way to demonstrate compliance. So we also often get a question is, what does control the day-to-day or long-term decisions mean? Well, in the SDVOSB context, the service-disabled veteran has to control essentially all decisions of the company, literally everything, except for 5 certain extraordinary circumstances that can provide for unanimous consent from other members or other owners. I will get into that in a later slide, what those mean. There are also, in addition to having this affirmative control, so SBA, VA currently would be looking for, okay, what does their resume show? How long have they been running the business? What is their title? Do they work full-time? Do they have any outside ownership employment? Things like that. But there are also instances where even if those conditions are met, a service-disabled veteran could be presumed not to control if there are certain conditions that a minority owner or another company has. I won't get into all of them because it's not an exhaustive list, and it's a pretty detailed list, but depending on your relationships or with your, with other companies, or if you have a minority owner, if they have another company, or if a minority owner has lent money to the company, things along those lines, those can all create presumptions of control by a non-service disabled veteran. SBA would also be looking for where the service disabled veteran resides. So if you have multiple office locations, how far away is the service disabled veteran from those office locations? If more than 150 miles, or if you have multiple locations, SBA may ask for a description of how the service disabled veteran is able to manage and control the company when he or she cannot be, physically in the location at all times. So these are kind of things to consider to make sure that when going through kind of the certification analysis. And going back to what I said in terms of what these individuals do not necessarily have to be the same, the ownership and control. You can have a circumstance where a service disabled veteran owns a company, 51% or more, but maybe is looking to retire and doesn't necessarily want to run the day-to-day anymore. Well, that person can hire and delegate to another service disabled veteran who is going to be essentially the one that's controlling the company. So you can meet the ownership and control requirements with different individuals. It does not necessarily have to be the same person. In terms of what are the benefits to the SDVOSB program and the certifications, you're able to go obviously after SDVOSB and then, as well as small business work. But then you can also go after work at the VA currently if you're CVE verified. That will soon change, as we'll get into, if you're going to be verified by SBA. But as I said, the VOSB is a set aside that is only available within the VA, and that is not changing as a result of these proposed rules. You're also eligible for sole source awards if there are not 2 or more SDVOSBs available, but the Rule 2 would still apply. As it currently applies for VA's market research, you have to be in the VIP database to see, if there's a company that's eligible to to provide the services that the VA is seeking. A big benefit is you can form joint ventures with other small businesses, other SDVOSBs, or your SBA approved mentor, and access set-asides that you may not otherwise want to or be eligible to kind of procure on your own. But if you come and form join forces with another entity through a joint venture, you might be able to put yourself on better footing. Looks like we did have one question on what percentage of disability qualifies as SDV. So you could actually have a percentage of 0% as long as you have a disability rating and letter from the VA. So you have to have that piece of paper with your application to demonstrate that you have a service-connected disability. Okay, so getting back to the ownership and control kind of considerations. So we talked initially at the outset of what is required, but then I kind of wanted to elaborate on some of those. So in terms of kind of the restrictions and maybe a little bit more of the things to think about. In terms of the ownership restrictions, like I said, direct ownership is required. So you cannot set up a holding company or own the business indirectly through another entity. This direct ownership requirement does have some downsides to it. It prevents you to be able to have more complex corporate structures of having multiple subsidiaries within your entity that also qualify as an SDVOSB. From a size perspective, if you have a subsidiary and then you sell off that subsidiary would be treated as a former affiliate. You cannot do that if you're just selling off like a division of your company that's not an exact separate subsidiary. So if you have different divisions of a company and you want to be able to pursue SDVOSB work with all those divisions, that has to stay in the one SDVOSB entity. But you cannot claim SDVOSB status if you have an actual subsidiary underneath the SDVOSB. That company would just be presumably a small business. So the direct ownership requirement kind of does put a little bit of a damper on the ability to have multiple subsidiaries if you're trying to still pursue SDVOSB work. Again, you can't segregate high risk business lines to limit liability because again, you're just in that the divisions versus subsidiary. If you're an S Corp, it could prevent you from being able to perform an F reorganization. Essentially, if you're trying to reorganize to allow another entity to acquire you, because S Corps are not allowed to be owned by entities. They have to be owned by individual people. Otherwise, you would blow the S election. So in order to fix that, if you're doing kind of a restructuring or a sale, you'd have to go through essentially an F reorganization and insert a holding company and all of that. So that would have an impact definitely on your SDVOSB status, because at that point, there would not be a direct ownership by an SDV at that point. So those are definitely things to consider. Some other ownership considerations, and something that we get a question about on a fair basis, is regarding the surviving spouse rule. So a lot of companies, they want, or individuals want to have a plan, an estate plan for, if something were to happen. In the SDVOSB world, there actually is this surviving spouse rule, which permits a company that's a service-disabled veteran-owned small business to continue on as such, even if the qualifying SDVOSB SDV owner dies. And how long that applies depends on the particular circumstances. So obviously in this rule, the ownership that the SDV had would have to transfer to his or her spouse in order for this rule to even be in play. Assuming that's the case, then the spouse can continue to qualify the company as an SDVOSB for 3 years after the date of the death of the veteran. This actually could be longer depending on certain circumstances. So if the SDV had a 100% disability rating or died due to a service-connected disability, then the spouse has the ability to continue the SDVOSB for a period of up to 10 years. For CVE purposes, it can stay in CVE if they were in CVE, but at the time that the SDV passed away. However, the 3 or 10-year period would expire early if the spouse either remarries or relinquishes ownership in the company. So there is an ability to keep going for how long, kind of depends on the specific circumstances, but it is something that you would want to review your corporate documents and your estate planning documents to make sure that it's set up for this particular circumstance, if this is something that you may want to consider. In the instances where a service-disabled veteran-owned small business is qualified based on a permanent caregiver, the surviving spouse rule does not apply in that instance, if assuming they're not a spouse. So just keep that in mind. So some of the control considerations as well. I mentioned that there are pretty strict control rules and that there are 5 extraordinary circumstances that you can permit a minority owner to have essentially unanimous consent or negative control over. And as you can see on the screen, they are addition of a new equity stakeholder, dissolving the company, sale of the company, merger of the company, or the company declaring bankruptcy. However, as the regulations currently stand, these are the only 5 unanimous consent or negative control provisions that are permissible. So if you have a minority owner or you're looking to maybe sell a minority interest, they very much need to understand the limitations of SBA's regulations or the limitations of the amount of control that they can have over the company. Going kind of back to what I said about the unconditional ownership, that also applies to, for example, a right of first refusal for the service-disabled veteran's ownership. There cannot be a requirement that the service-disabled veteran first have to offer their ownership to sell to either the company or to the minority owner before the service-disabled veteran decides to sell. These are all things that might be, commonplace in like the regular commercial corporate world, but in the SDVOSB world, the regulations are pretty strict. So this is currently the only 5 permissible negative control items that a minority owner can have. So this does potentially limit the ability to receive outside investments, private equity, more established companies or things like that. Who are really just not willing to take on the risk of the amount of control that the service-disabled veteran must have, and then on the flip side, the amount of control that the minority owners cannot have. So this is definitely something to consider and be mindful of, because this is a big piece, especially for certifications. Other things to note, it does limit options like convertible debt and things like that, because if you've issued stock options or things along those lines, SBA will treat them essentially as exercised. So even if when exercised, the service-disabled veteran will have to have control over the company and have that majority 51% ownership. Other control restrictions or considerations to consider is that, as I mentioned, the service-disabled veteran must be the highest officer and have suitable experience of the extent and complexity needed to run the company. This is looked at very carefully and could be, an area of concern or fraud, depending on the circumstances of the application. So you want to make sure that not just that you're the highest officer, but that you have, sufficient experience of the extent and complexity needed to run the company. General management experience it can be sufficient. Again, this is really on a case-by-case, individual-by-individual basis. But as you can see here, we had an instance where someone had managed, an entire repair department, did handyman work, and then ultimately took over a construction firm. So while he had management experience, he had no management experience, running a construction company. So the CVE, denied the application on the basis of not having management experience at the extent and complexity needed to run a company. So you have to show that the skills, that you've received or have are somewhat transferable to the type of business that you're seeking to qualify. Oftentimes, of course, service of veterans have, management experience in the military, and whether or not that is transferable, obviously, again, depends on the specific circumstances. But if, you're moving around quite a bit, you don't have experience in a technical industry, that could potentially call into question whether the service-disabled veteran has the, the management experience of the extent and complexity needed to run the company. So kind of getting into what the proposed rule says, what's currently required and what's going to be happening. So currently, most companies, you're still able to self-certify as an SDVOSB for all non-VA procurements. However, the 2021 NDAA provided for elimination of the VA's certification program and has transferred the responsibility of certifying SDVOSBs and VOSBs to the SBA. So beginning under the NDAA, directed that all SDVOSBs must be certified by SBA. SBA was given 2 years to consolidate the database with its own and essentially take over. The 2021 NDAA went into effect January 1st, 2021. So SBA had until, or has until January 1st, 2023 to get this into place. So SBA has finally issued their proposed rule on July 6th, 2022. Comments have closed on this, but they have, included how this is potentially going to work starting in January. So I'm going to touch on what the proposed rule says. And again, this is a proposed rule. The final rule has not yet been issued, although SBA has announced that the final rule should be in place by December 1st, 2022. So typically when an agency publishes a final rule, they do so about 30 days ahead of the effective date. So based on the statement that a final rule will be in place by December 1st, it's possible that they could issue the final rule by November 1st. But again, the requirement is January 1st, 2023. So at the latest, the final rule should be issued by December 1st. And then you'll have until it will go into effect 30 days later, essentially January 1st. In the proposed rule, SBA has explained that there will be a 1-year grace period for SDVOSBs that are currently self-certified to file an application with the SBA. So I'll get into kind of what will be needed if you're going to be bidding on SDVOSB work within that 1-year grace period, but they will be allowing for a grace period. But if you're going to be bidding, you're going to need to have submitted an application at minimum. So firms who are currently verified by CVE will be deemed eligible by SBA for the time that remains on their current 3-year term of eligibility. So for example, if you just underwent recertification and got your letter, let's say September 1st, 2022, and you're good to go for another 3 years, SBA will recognize that and you'll be good, assuming no material change, until September 1st, 2025 under SBA's program. So they're going to take, on the rest. So if you have a year left, you'll get that next year, things like that. SBA is proposing to grant reciprocity for 8A and WSBs or EDWSBs that are owned by SDVs or veterans. So I'm not sure if anyone on the webinar is also a WOSB, but you may recall when SBA implemented the WOSB certification requirement, they incorporated a reciprocity for 8As and for SDVOSBs. Essentially, you would demonstrate You've already proven the ownership and control requirements for either 8A or SDVOSB. So as long as you can demonstrate to SBA that the company is owned, at least the majority, by a woman, then you should essentially be grandfathered in more or less to the certification without a need for a full certification review. So that is currently what SBA is proposing to do here as well with SDVOSBs. SBA noted in the proposed rule that the ownership or control requirements across the programs are, quote, basically the same. They are definitely not the same exactly. As I noted on prior slides, the extraordinary circumstances for control, those 5 items, that exists only in the SDVOSB world. That does not, a similar regulation does not exist in the 8A women-owned or economically disadvantaged women-owned. So SBA is essentially saying, you know, the ownership and control requirements are more or less the same, which they are very similar, but they're not the exact same. You would also, if you're going to be applying based on this reciprocity process, then you will need to certify with your application that there's been no material change to your ownership or control with the application. So if you've, you know, were verified as a women-owned small business and then underwent an ownership change and haven't reported that to SBA, first of all, you should definitely report that to SBA if you haven't already. But then second of all, you would have to certify with the application that there hasn't been any changes to the ownership or maybe your operating agreement or bylaws with your new SDVOSB application. Like I said, SBA has said the final rule should be in place by December 1st. They've also announced that they have hired a vendor to build the platform. At the time of the proposed rule back in July, they're still figuring out what this platform is going to be. Recently, I think it was last month, SBA announced that they have finally hired a vendor to build the platform. If you're 8A or WSB or part of the Mentor Protege program, you might be familiar with the Certify or Beta.Certify platform. So I would assume there's going to be something very similar for the SDVOSB program. My hope would be that they're going to utilize what CVE has done in their VIP program because it's a lot more user-friendly than the Certify systems, but time will tell. So hopefully that system will be up and running by January 1st. So we'll just kind of have to play it by ear on how applications will be submitted. And SBA will, of course, you know, include announcements on this as well as we get closer. Other noticeable mentions in the proposed rule is that SBA has actually expanded or proposed to expand the ability to qualify as small for any NAICS code under which you're currently conducting business. So if you've gone through the CVE application, you know that you can only have NAICS codes in your profile that you qualify as small under. But one of the things that SBA will look at is whether the company is, or sorry, the VA or CVE will look at is whether the company is small under its primary code as designated in SAM. If you're not small under the primary code, you may not be eligible for SDVOSB certification as it currently stands. However, SBA has said this doesn't make a ton of sense because if you're small under a code, you should be able to, and meet the eligibility criteria, you should be able to pursue work under that code as an SDVOSB, even if that code is not your primary code. So you should be able to just demonstrate that you're small under any code that you currently conduct business under, and that can be the code that you select for your SDVOSB application. As part of the proposed rule, companies can continue to self-certify for non-SDVOSB contracts, and agencies can still take credit. So if you're an SDVOSB and you're bidding on a small business set aside, but you're not verified or certified as an SDVOSB, but you're like, very sure you meet the requirements, you can check the box that you're an SDVOSB, and agencies can still take credit for, a small business and SDVOSB. You do not need to be certified for that instance because the contract itself was not set aside for SDVOSBs. But if you're up for a sole source, SDVOSB sole source or SDVOSB set aside, you must be certified beginning January 1 for all agencies. SBA is going to clarify through all of its rules that the same certification standards apply to both SDVOSBs and VOSBs. Right now, SBA's regulations do not make any mention to VOSBs because this is not a program that they currently use. It's only in the VA. So now that everything is transferring over, they will reference VOSBs. But again, VOSB set-asides will apply only in the VA context. SBA is proposing to keep the same appeals process to SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals if an application is denied. But they are proposing to eliminate a reconsideration process. So SBA specifically sought comments on that. If an application is denied and you do not appeal, you can then reapply after 90 days. If it is appealed and it's affirmed, you would have to wait 90 days from the date of the appeal denial as well. So they're trying to shorten the timeline for you to be able to reapply if you do receive an actual denial. SBA is proposing to keep the 3-year eligibility period that the VA currently has in place. And right now, for all the programs except for 8A, there's no prior approval if there's any material change. So if there's any material change in ownership, operating agreement, things like that, there's no prior approval needed, but there is a notification requirement. SBA sought comments on whether or not prior approval would be required. So hopefully people commented that they would not want the prior SBA approval. This will definitely hold things up significantly if the 8A realm is any indication of that. Okay, so in terms of how to submit offers, companies will be able to submit an offer. So on SDVOSB set-asides, as long as the application has been submitted and it's pending with SBA. So this is again similar to what they've included for the women-owned certification. As long as you've submitted the application, you're eligible to bid. If then you are identified as the apparent successful offer and have not yet received a decision from SBA on your application, you will essentially be prioritized and moved to the top of the pile for SBA to review and either say yay or nay prior to the agency making an award. For joint ventures, definitely wanted to flag this. So if you do work with the VA as an SDVOSB joint venture, VOSB joint venture now, you're probably aware that you have to be certified. The JV itself has to be certified by CBE as a joint venture. SBA is going to keep that requirement that the joint ventures must be certified to be awarded an SDVOSB or VOSB contract with the VA, just like it currently is. But they are not going to require certification of joint ventures for other agencies. So it's going to exist just like it does now for women-owned, HubZone, 8A for competitive. So you will not, the JV itself, unless you're pursuing a VA procurement, does not need to be certified by SBA as an SDVOSB joint venture. Other thing, I know this is kind of a hot button topic or is becoming more clear. SBA is also including a proposed language in its regulations that an SDVOSB or VOSB participant cannot be a joint venture partner on more than one joint venture for a specific contract, SDVOSB or VOSB contract. So if there's, like a GWAC or an SDVOSB IDIQ, that one company that's part of one joint venture could not participate in multiple joint ventures. I know with Polaris, there's been some confusion or not loving the clarification that companies cannot bid with multiple, mentors cannot have multiple proteges that they're forming multiple JVs with and then bidding, things like that. So this is definitely something kind of on a more larger scale that SBA is looking at and is including rules on at various processes. So just something to keep in mind. In terms of how status protests are processed, the proposed rule states that all of these will now essentially be with SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals, regardless of procuring agency. So right now, for an SDVOSB set-aside, you still file the status protest with the contracting officer, but then who processes it depends on the agency. If it's a VA procurement, then it's processed by SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals. If for all others, it's processed by SBA. So now all status protests are being proposed to be handled at OHA, regardless of whatever agency the procurement is for. Okay, so how do I prepare for this certification? If you are currently certified by CVE and you're within your renewal period, so your certification is going to expire in 120 days or less, I strongly recommend you go through your recertification now with CVE. Then you will be good for almost 3 full years with SBA. So if you're currently certified, not sure, should I wait, should I whatever, absolutely go through your renewal. And hopefully that decision will be made by the end of the year. And if it's good, then it should transfer over to SBA. If you are not within your recertification window, so maybe you were just recertified or you were certified a year or 2 ago, but you're not in that 120-day timeline, there's nothing you can do. No actions required, your status will transfer, and then whenever your recertification period or your certification period is up, you're going to do your new certification application with SBA instead of CVE. I'm not sure if files and things like that will transfer. So to the extent you want to download or save any of your documents from your CVE VIP profile, I'd strongly recommend doing that sooner rather than later. If you are not currently certified by CVE, I strongly recommend that you start and complete an application with CVE now. It is, a couple month-ish process, so we're getting close to the end of the year. So if you're not already certified, I would strongly recommend doing this now. SBA anticipates upwards of 35,000 applications for SDVOSBs when the certification rule goes into effect. It is going to take a significant period of time for SBA to process those applications. CVE should be able to process it if you submit it now by the end of the year. Strongly recommend doing your certification. If you need assistance with the application, I frequently help our clients with them. Feel free to reach out and I'll see how I can help you. As part of that review and how to prepare, you may want to have your governing documents, your articles, your operating agreement, your bylaws, your stock, all of that reviewed by an attorney to ensure that you're complying with the ownership and control requirements that I discussed. If those are not met, it's going to delay your application. It could get denied or it could get kicked back, things like that. You want to be as prepared as possible to either do your application now or your re-verification application with SBA. But it's crucial to get your ducks in a row because this is going to be a massive influx on the SBA and things are not going to get processed quickly. It's going to take a significant period of time. So you do need to be patient, and the easiest way to do that is to do your certification with CVE now. Just a couple remarks in closing. In terms of maximizing your certification, so kind of tagging along to what are the benefits. Like I mentioned, the SBA Mentor Protege program, I'm sure you're aware, is now open to all small businesses and socioeconomic designations. This provides for an exemption from affiliation. So if you want to bring on a minority owner, that's an entity, they're going to be doing a lot of assistance for you. You might be doing a lot of subcontracts, things like that. You would definitely want to consider a mentor protege agreement before you jump into that. Otherwise, you could be looking at an affiliation concern, which could not only impact your small business status, but also your SDVOSB status. Form the joint ventures. If you do form a joint venture, you can use I'm assuming you would be the managing venture as the SDVOSB, you can use your size and status. So you can partner with large businesses to go after set-aside work and rely on their certifications. If they are a large business though, you do have to have an SBA approved mentor protege agreement in place prior to proposal submission. Being an SDVOSB, presents a good marketing tool to large primes who want to meet their subcontracting goals. As you may be aware, there are, every agency has contracting goals, and then for any full and open procurement, there should be a goal that a percentage of subcontracts have to be awarded to certain socioeconomic designations, including SDVOSBs. So you can market yourself as an SDVOSB to large primes, and they can take credit, and it's a win-win. You can also qualify as a similarly situated entity if you're bidding with other SDVOSBs. And then you can use, your company or your joint venture, what have you, to go after these larger multiple acquisition contracts, GWACs, schedule work, things like that, to try to prolong, the contracts and get as much work as you possibly can. That was everything that I had for you. I don't think, let me go through my questions and I will answer them, see what's left. And one question we had is, my SDVOSB recertification was accomplished earlier this year. However, my women-owned is due in January 23. Does this mean I do not have to renew my women-owned before June? So the women-owned process is completely separate from this. It's, if you want to still process your women-owned certification just as you would in January, but for purposes of your SDVOSB certification, if it was accomplished this year, you should be good in this year, or in that day, month through 2025. So the women-owned, that's just a way to use the certification for SDVOSBs if you're not already certified by CVE as an SDVOSB. One question was to clarify, JV needs to apply for CVE to submit a Piliero's proposal. No, it definitely does not. It's a non-VA procurement. Only JV certification is going to be required for VA procurements. If the joint venture is approved by CVE prior to December 31st, will they be enjoy the eligibility period? I would assume so. The regulation, to my knowledge, or the proposed rule, to my knowledge, does not expressly discuss this, but any company that's certified by CVE currently or by December 31st will transfer to SBA. I see no reason why that should not also include joint ventures. My CVE certification expired 2 years ago. Should I recertify now or wait? I would definitely do it now, sooner rather than later. I think that was everything. If you have anything else, feel free to send me an email. Someone said in one of the comments something I said was opposite of the slide. Sorry, I don't know exactly what that was, but if you have a clarifying question, please feel free to send me an email and I can clarify if what I said was not correct. Yeah, I think that was everything we had. Thank you again for joining. And like I said, if you need any help with certifications or review, feel free to reach out. And a copy of this presentation will be available on our YouTube site in the coming days. Thank you.